So what I want to do now is introduce you all to Sam Baker. We're going to tell a little story about how we know Sam, and then we will get started. So Sam Baker is the CEO of WriggleBrew. WriggleBrew is a startup in Central Florida. They're dedicated to sustainable agriculture solutions. With a background in economics and research experience across multiple scientific disciplines, Sam has spearheaded WriggleBrew's growth, including the launch of its flagship organic plant growth accelerator. He's a lifelong innovator. He's earned honors like the Cade Prize and recognition as an INNO Under 25 honoree. An Eagle Scout, a scuba diver, and an environmental advocate, Sam continues to drive WriggleBrew's mission to improve agriculture and protect ecosystems. So we're really grateful to have Sam with us tonight. And Jessica from our team is going to give a little bit of an introduction about how we know Sam.
Yeah, it's a little bit of a unique story. So I'm really grateful to be connected with WriggleBrew. I had hosted a workshop for my spiritual community at my house, and I have a friend who came over and suggested that he introduced me to one of our mutual friends who I didn't know at the time. She's a mutual friend, Stacy now, and I invited her over to my house. And we got talking about things we were interested in personally. And then I started telling her about what I did for work and my work with algae and its mission. And as Camille described, I told her all about my passion for improving soil health and the grower's mission to really improve their production. So she knew of a friend who is her very personal good friend who happened to be working with Sam, and she saw an alignment in Soil's mission with WriggleBrew's mission, and she made an introduction to Karin. And then Karin and I chatted, and we found even greater alignment, and Meredith was part of that conversation as well. And we identified that we are trying to improve soil health and the way growers are using nitrogen and their fertility programs. And we really understood the impact we could have with a stack solution, as Camille was saying, between WriggleBrew and in soil in a grower system. And so the relationship just blossomed from there. And sure enough, there are huge synergies between in-soil algae and WriggleBrew. So we're happy to have you, Sam. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks,
you for
Jessica.
having me. Thank you for the introduction. I'm really excited. So I suppose with that, should I get started my presentation? Cool. Okay.
Go for it.
Thank you, guys. So I'm Sam. I have a very cool presentation for you guys about earthworms. I think also to Camille's point about networking and connections, it's one of those interesting things, how you know people who know people, and through these little connections, you end up finding your way to totally different places than you expected. It's actually a very good analogy for the soil, because the soil is a very interconnected mesh. That's something people are discovering more and more about it as more research is done, how much things like fungi and mycorrhiza and mycelium are connected into root systems and are connected into bacterial populations. So I now want to talk about another piece of that interconnected web, and that is the humble earthworm. So I'm going to share my screen with you guys. And yep, I think you should be able to see it now. I've got an earthworm wizard on the TV. I don't know if you can see him there.
Yeah, yep, you're all set.
Cool. Okay. So the title of this presentation is not The Power of Earthworms. It's actually a more verbose, longer thing that's in the title of the Zoom, but I'm just going to call it The Power of Earthworms now because that's what my slide is called. So earthworms are very deeply underappreciated. The story of when they became known to be useful for agriculture actually only goes back about 100 years. So a lot of people assume that because, we see earthworms in the ground that we've always just known that they're actually good for plants, but that's not really the case. In the 1800s, earthworms were actually assumed to be a pest. They were viewed as bad for plants, and so they were really killed on site in a lot of places. It was only some gardeners and some farmers who knew their value. Most of academia derided them as basically pests. It was Charles Darwin who was the first to identify really that earthworms might have a beneficial role. He noted that in potted plants that had earthworms that he was growing, the plants with the earthworms seemed to do better than those without them. So he published a paper on this, which was immediately derided by the entire scientific community. So not much has changed in the last 100 years. Basically, everyone said, Darwin, you're full of crap. There's no way worms are good for plants. Everyone knows they come out of apples and stuff. And he made one enemy, a German scientist, well, at the time, I believe it was actually Bavaria, not Germany, but he was so disbelieving of Darwin and so opposed to the concept that earthworms were good for plants that he spent 10 years studying their impact on soil. And in the end, he had to concede to Darwin that he was correct, that earthworms seem to have a very useful role for soil. And so Darwin compiled the research from this German scientist alongside his own observations. And the very last publication he made before he died was on earthworms. Since then, we really honestly haven't discovered a whole lot more about earthworms and how they benefit soil when we really consider it, because around the early 20th century, we introduced artificial fertilizers. So that's when the whole NPK craze began in the 1920s and 30s, when the Haber-Bosch process was uncovered, and we were able to produce vast quantities of nitrogen and phosphorus compounds. So the discovery that earthworms could produce useful manures kind of got swept under the rug in the 20th century. And only now in the 21st century are we finally starting to reinvestigate earthworms and determine how exactly they are useful to plants. Before I get too much deeper into the earthworms, I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself, why I care about earthworms, because I'm not the typical person you would think who would be really interested in them. But I am an Eagle Scout, as was mentioned in the introduction, so I've spent a lot of time camping, and I'm also a huge science nerd. In high school, I spent every single year going to the science fair, and I spent more time in my chemistry teacher's lab than I practically spent anywhere else. And I had a best friend in high school named Gabe. He's actually over there. By the way, we're in our lab right now. That's Gabe. He has the Beatles-looking haircut. Gabe and I were extraordinarily interested in environmental science, and eventually we won a few science fairs and some scholarships, which allowed us to study at the University of Central Florida. There, we got to work at the AMPAC Nanomaterials Lab, which was a really cool position for a freshman. So we got to study a lot of activated carbon at the time. And we also, while we were there, turned our environmental passion into a club. We started a club called the Knights of Trash. The mascot for the UCF, University of Central Florida, is the Knights. So we started the Knights of Trash. We went around campus on crusades, picking up garbage. And of course, we were still in the lab studying dirt. So we actually got a lot of time looking at the dirt in our home state of Florida. And we learned that the home state of Florida dirt is really sand. So this is what that looks like. This is Mayaca soil. This is very, very common in Florida and actually throughout several parts of the South. And it's a very sandy kind of soil. On the right, we actually have more traditional, healthy Mayaca. And on the left, we have more modern Mayaca. And the reason there is a difference between the two is because of the 20th century revolution in fertilizer. So I mentioned we were in the 1920s and 30s starting the production of things like ammonia, urea, nitrogen compounds, and also phosphoric compounds. Those compounds, we've been using them more and more, and as a consequence, we have seen soil degradation. We have seen the depletion of soil nutrients. That's one of the ironic things about fertilizer. So if you spend a lot of time in Florida or in a lot of places in the country, you may notice that the soil is looking a lot less dark. And so that has been caused a lot by these fertilizers. But the reason for the color change chemically is because of the carbon content and because of the biological activity. So these two soils actually have basically the same amount of carbon in them, but the available carbon in the soil on the left is much, much lower. So what has happened here is the soil on the right is much more biologically active. It has a lot of bacteria and fungi in it, and decomposers, things like earthworms, things like isopods and nematodes and springtails. So there's a lot of life here, which is feeding on both the cellulose and the lignin and the wood and various leaf litter and detritus, and it's breaking that down into smaller and smaller pieces of carbon, but also it's producing things like indole acetic acid and humic acid and fulvic acid, these complex organic acids that make up the humus that gives soil its dark color. which are compounds that are really good for holding in moisture. They're really good for playing host to microbes. As many people know, biochar, which is basically just carbon, is really, really good at holding in microbes. So you get this dark color because the carbon is more evenly spread. It's fluffed up like a pillow. It's distributed throughout the soil. Whereas on the left, you have, yes, the same total amount of carbon, but it's all locked up in large pieces of undecayed wood or undecayed plant matter. So it isn't in a usable format, even though it's the same amount of carbon. And as I said, this has been driven a lot by fertilizer. So a lot is said these days about fertilizer runoff, and runoff is a side effect of soil degradation. So when we have really healthy soil, it's difficult for molecules to move through that soil quickly. So if you have urea or ammonia produced by, let's say, a nitrobacter, a bacteria that produces nitrogen compounds, it is going to be produced, one, near the roots of a plant, usually, which means it's much more likely to be absorbed quickly. And two, if rain or water inundates the soil, well, the fluffier, larger molecular structure of things like humic acid and fulvic acid will prevent that nitrogen from flowing through the soil easily. Whereas soil that is biologically dead, that doesn't have microbes fluffing it up, it acts almost like a sieve. It just, the small molecules of nitrogen and phosphorus just flow right through it. And consequently, they're able to get around really easily. So when we use things like nitrogen fertilizers, a lot of the ammonias and ureas of the world, when we overuse them, we find that bacteria and fungi die off because you're dumping urea and ammonia on stuff. It acts like a free radical. It rips apart cell walls. And then we find that as it does that, as it kills a lot of these microbes, the soil becomes more porous. And the porosity means that more of these molecules can flow through the soil and kill more stuff. And the soil eventually becomes so porous and so open and sandy, essentially, that we end up seeing runoff. We end up seeing fertilizer not even getting into plant root structures or going to plants, but just flowing straight through this sand out into waterways, where it then leads to things like we have here in Florida or in California called red tide, where we have massive toxic algal blooms, not the good algae that you get from things like in soil, but the poison algae that you find in the ocean. And that leads to things like fish kills. And it creates this negative feedback loop. This is the really horrifying thing about modern industrial agrochemical fertilizer. It destroys the soil, which makes you more dependent on buying more chemical fertilizer, which then destroys the soil further. And it creates this horrible negative feedback loop. So in essence, we have a kind of a fertilizer more like a steroid than we do like a supplement to the plant. And of course, people end up overusing their fertilizers, and that leads to necrosis from burn, because eventually plants themselves are affected by an over inundation of nitrogen or phosphorus. And that has seriously negative consequences for farmers, because obviously they're trying to grow crops and they end up killing crops with things that they purchase to grow them. So that's a really bad outcome. And nitrogen, aside from burning plants, is not alone in causing long-term damage to the soil, because phosphorus does this as well. Phosphorus contributes very heavily to runoff, but phosphoric acid, one of the products produced by phosphorus fertilizers, is extremely deleterious to soil because it bonds with metals. So we all know that plants need NPK, they need those 3 nutrients, but they in fact need a total of about 13 nutrients. So that includes micros and secondaries. That's stuff like calcium, magnesium, molybdenum, sulfur, nickel, copper, iron, other stuff like that. Those compounds, a lot of the metal ones, so the irons, the manganeses, the zincs, the molybdenums of the world, bond very strongly to phosphoric acid. So if you use too much phosphorus, you end up creating zinc phosphate and molybdenum phosphate, and those compounds are insoluble. They do not dissolve. They cannot be absorbed by plants, by their root structures, and that means that by using phosphorus fertilizer, yes, you get more growth in the plant in the short run, but in the long run, you're completely depleting the soil of all of its secondary micro metallic nutrients. And this is a seriously bad thing in a lot of the world. In India, it is such a big problem that the use of phosphorus is estimated to be responsible for about 4% of all global child deaths. And the reason is because phosphorus bonds to zinc very selectively, and zinc is absolutely necessary in our diet to develop our immune system. So children in India, they eat a lot of rice that's grown with very heavily industrial fertilizer grown crops. And so the soil over the last 30 or 40 years has been depleted of all its zinc. but they're not adding more zinc into it. You can still get rice to grow without really adding much zinc, but you end up with rice that's 3 or 4 times less rich in zinc. And so the children become zinc deficient, and then therefore they get immunocompromised, and then they die. And this happens to children in the thousands. And it's a terrible irony because we're using this fertilizer in the hopes to create more prosperity, to create more growth, to create more crops, to feed more children. And ironically, we're feeding them food that is, bad for them in a sense, that is not containing the nutrients we want them to. Famously in Florida, there's been analyses on our oranges. We find that the oranges of today compared to the oranges of 1960s and the 1970s are 6 times less rich in nutrients. They are deeply less nutritious than the same oranges we were growing here just a few decades ago. And that can be very clearly linked to the uptick in the use of phosphorus and nitrogen fertilizers. So this is a really big problem. It leads to fish kills in Florida. It's a huge problem. And for me, it became something I was personally concerned with because my family's lived in Florida for like a really long time. We've lived here for 7 or 8 generations. And we used to go fishing a lot. Fishing is a big part of my family's, culture, I guess. And there's a spot near Lake Harney, if you're from Central Florida, a little pond where we had gone fishing. I think my grandpa had gone fishing there with his dad, and so on and so forth. And this spot, all of the fish there were killed when we went to visit it once in 2019. All the fish were dead, and they were all dead because there was a fertilizer runoff event. In fact, there were several in the summer of 2019 across the state. Famously, there was one in Cedar Key that led to a radiation spike because of all the phosphorus. But our little pond was destroyed. It was absolutely wiped out. And this was extraordinarily concerning to me when I was a freshman, because it made me realize, if there's ever an 8th generation of my family, there may be nowhere left for them to go fishing here in Florida. So there's a quote that was said during another crisis we had in this country from a relatively okay president, FDR. He said that a nation that destroys its soil destroys itself. The conditions that we were facing down in the 1930s when he was president was a depletion of our soil due to a lack of crop rotation. We were depleting the topsoil of its nutrition and of its fiber and of its quality. And so we were getting the Dust Bowl. We were getting, massive erosion. And so FDR recognized this, and so did a lot of other farmers throughout the U.S., and we had to change our ways. I fear in a twist of fate, about 100 years later, we've come to almost the same position. We are now here in the 2020s and the 2030s, finding ourselves where our national soil is once again being depleted, this time of micronutrients, this time of its microbiome. And so what is the solution to that? Well, I didn't really know because I was a chemistry major, not a biology major, but my best friend Gabe, he was a biochemistry major, and he's a lot smarter than I am, and he had a lot of interest in soil microbiology and in decomposer organisms. And so after witnessing all the fish being killed in our local area, I asked him if he had any ideas to address this. And Gabe mentioned that, well, of course, there are many natural mechanisms for restoring soil quality. We have thousands of microbes whose entire ecological niche is to do that. But there's also an organism that basically by itself is extremely good at doing this, and that organism is the earthworm. And so Gabe started telling me about how useful earthworms are. And it turns out earthworms are probably the single best organism on the planet when it comes to forming manures and when it comes to fixing soil. They have abilities that no other organisms have. They are especially adapted to both recover and rescue soil quality, but also to produce nutrients and compounds for plants in order to help them grow. So Gabe originally showed me a video of a fellow in Puerto Rico who was growing earthworms in giant plywood bins. And he showed me that this man was making a living just selling the earthworm castings and what they call worm tea, which is where you take earthworm castings and you brew it into a liquid. And it was very amazing to me because one, didn't realize you could, farm earthworms. It seems almost like an exotic kind of thing. I mean, you guys probably are laughing at that a little bit because, in the farming community, everyone knows about that. But as a chemistry freshman, I had no idea. And So I was really amazed that people were farming them. And it raises a natural question because study after study has been published showing that earthworms, one, improve soil, but two, the castings from the earthworms can be used to make this tea. And this tea is just as effective, if not more effective, than nitrogen and phosphorus style fertilizers. And it was doubly confusing when you think, okay, well, we know there's huge problems with nitrogen and phosphorus fertilizers, and we can produce an alternative to them from food waste and garbage. We can feed that excess compost and what have you to earthworms, and they extraordinarily easily, with no energy input really, poop out this magic material that is extremely good for plants. In the bottom right corner here, I have a picture of a Ohio State study on growing tomatoes. On the left, we have water, and then on the right, we have an increasing amount of using worm tea. So it all raises this question, why is this not something being used in agriculture on a large scale? Why? Because, you know, in Florida here, we're banning nitrogen and phosphorus fertilizer use from June to September in a lot of counties, and in some counties all year round, which is causing a huge amount of economic strain. So if there's this alternative, do we even, why bother banning it when we can just make this thing that's useful to people that is better? Well, it turns out there's a lot of problems with it. It turns out that earthworm teas, you tend to have a shelf life of about 2 days. And the reason for that is because they are a manure tea. They are full of microbes. And those microbes, when you close up a bottle, they tend to die off very quickly. Or when oxygen access is forestalled, you have the anaerobic population explode. You have things like salmonella and pathogens explode in population. And those microbes are really something you don't want to have in a fertilizer. They have the opposite impact. So this worm tea, as good as it is, it can't be produced, or rather it can't be used anywhere except where it's produced, which makes it logistically completely non-competitive. Which is a shame because earthworm manures have some really amazing chemistry to them. For one, they are full of carbon. Yeah, that's nice. They're full of humic acid and fulvic acid, which are really good compounds to have near plant root systems. Those compounds are good for bringing in metal ions. They are natural chelators, which means they protect ions and make them soluble. They are also just a good source of carbon and nitrogen. But worm castings are also full of certain nutrient compounds that you cannot find literally anywhere else. For example, amorphous calcium carbonate is a really big component in worm castings. Worms form them as a part of their pH regulation system in their body. They have an organ called a calciferous gland that they use, sort of like how we produce saliva to neutralize acidic foods. They produce these interesting calcium compounds to neutralize acidic substances as they eat them. And the calcium compound that they produce, the amorphous calcium carbonate, is a unique kind of calcium that is more easily absorbed by plants than any other variety of calcium. And it is a calcium that we humans cannot replicate in the lab right now. Earthworms produce a special mixture of proteins and enzymes that protect this calcium because it's very unstable. And they are able to make a calcium carbonate that can last years in the soil or in a liquid, whereas the best we've been able to do in laboratories today is produce calcium that goes bad, or rather decays within like days or weeks. So there are a lot of compounds like that earthworms produce that can't be produced anywhere else. The slime of earthworms is actually a protein material that is full of chelators and full of nitrogen because it's proteins. But they also produce specialized plant hormones. So indolacetic acid is one that earthworms produce in their gut. It is an extremely effective plant hormone that helps in the growth of the plant. It acts like an auxin, an AUXIN, which is a hormone used for regulating plant leaf growth. Earthworms also are natural chelators, so they chelate both through their digestive process and through their mucus. Basically, every single one of the 13 nutrients, with the exception of chlorine, they are the only organisms we know that do that. They also have nitrogen-fixing bacteria in their gut. Earthworms also produce compounds that react positively with things like phosphorus in the soil to solubilize that phosphorus. In 2021, it was discovered that earthworms produce a compound in their gut that preserves polyphenol compounds. So those are the defensive compounds of plants, which means that earthworm castings are not just rich in nutrients, they're also rich in things that actively defend plants from pests. But they can't really be used, or they couldn't really be used, because earthworm casting teas go bad extremely quickly. So as freshman researchers at UCF, Gabe and I decided that, well, in our hubris, let's shift our research away from soil biomes and from carbon compounds towards making worm teas useful. So we ended up spending about 3 years on that project. And we found several ways to improve the efficacy of earthworm teas. We found that you can filter out a lot of the insoluble stuff that makes it clogging to agricultural systems. You can make a giant French press basically and squeeze out all the solubles. We also found that you can control the chemical content of it by putting earthworms on a diet. Feeding them the kinds of things you want them to eat means that those nutrients will end up in the tea. And we also found that you can control the microbiome in the earthworm casting tea and make it shelf stable. The way we figured out to do that is kind of like pasteurization for milk. It's not exactly the same, but it's similar. We essentially isolate from the gut of the worm exactly the microbes we want. We put those microbes in a state of hibernation, and we kill all the other microbes in the tea. That way, it's inoculated with a hibernating culture of only positive microbes. And when we analyze the chemical content of a worm tea made in this manner, we find that compared to all other organic fertilizers you find on the market, it has a far better composition. It is much more powerful chemically. And when you grow plants with it, it performs very, very well. So this is one of the first batches of plants we ever grew. These are lettuce plants in my dorm closet. These guys on the left here are grown with water, and just these 4 over here. And on the right, we have an increasing eyedropper amount of what we started to call WriggleBrew. And so you can see, even though these are all about 14 days old, the lettuce plant on the far right, which is given a full eyedropper of WriggleBrew at the beginning of that 14-day period, is doing way better. It has a much larger size to it, but also when we analyzed it, it had much better root structure and better pubescence on the leaves. And when we did a protein analysis of it, it was doing a lot better as well. And so that's very encouraging. But that's only one half of the coin, So I mentioned in the beginning, the big problem with nitrogen and phosphorus fertilizers is that they destroy soil microbiology. They kill a lot of the microbes in the soil. And so the question is, okay, well, yeah, you can make a worm tea, but how does that actually impact the soil in the long run? Well, from our analysis, it actually affects the soil microbiology very positively. So this is the soil around a corn plant that we inoculated with WriggleBrew. This is before the inoculation. And we can see that it has a relatively standard smattering of mycelium and other things. It's, not tremendously special. And this is 2 weeks after inoculating with WriggleBrew. And we can see a huge difference in the amount of microbiology there. So what this is showing us is that the worm tea is not just acting to encourage growth to the plant. It's not just acting as a steroid. It is also improving the soil biology. So it's adding more microbes in. And that means the soil is going to be able to better recycle nutrients in the long run. And it means that the plant is going to be hardier to diseases and to other kinds of things. The consequence is this fertilizer can be used at the beginning of a plant's life when it's a seed, and it doesn't need to be continuously reapplied. It can be applied once, and then it's kind of a fire and forget sort of system. And that means that the farmer doesn't have to use nearly as much of this stuff, but it also means you're having an upward trajectory in your soil health rather than downward one that you're continually trying to lift up. So that's a really good result. But we found some more interesting results of this. So these are plants that had a spider mite infestation on them, and they're mulberries. The ones on the right, we sprayed with a bottle with the worm tea, with the WriggleBrew, and those on the left, we sprayed with just water. And what's really interesting here is, one, we're seeing the plants have a greater resilience to the spider mite infestation, which makes sense. They have more nutrients, which means they're healthier. But we're also seeing that the spider mite population is declining and disappearing. So they're actually dying off. And that's a really interesting result because it's not something you'd expect from an organic fertilizer. The question is, well, why is that happening? Well, I mentioned earlier that earthworms they preserve polyphenol compounds. They preserve plant defensive compounds. Well, plant defensive compounds are things like caffeic acid, capsaicin, caffeine, jasmonic acid. These are compounds that plants produce that actually can be used to kill pests. So when a spider mite bites into something like a milkweed, it's getting a mouthful of polyphenol compounds, defensive compounds that the milkweed produces to dissuade that pest from eating it. And those compounds cause one, mandible irritation. They cause foaming sometimes. Sometimes they cause the mandibles to fall off. And in other cases, they clog up or disrupt the digestive tract of the insect and can even lead to its death. And so earthworms, because they have a very symbiotic relationship with plants, have developed biologically a system that allows themselves to eat things like capsaicin and caffeic acid and jasmonic acid, and it doesn't kill the earthworm. In fact, the earthworm produces a special compound called a surfactant enzyme to coat around these polyphenol compounds so that the earthworm essentially poops them out unharmed, undigested, and in a soluble state so that the next generation of plants get access to the prior generation's recycled polyphenol compounds. And what that means is you take those worm castings from worms that were fed a rich diet of polyphenols, you get a worm casting that can be dissolved in liquid that, when sprayed on the surface of a plant, coats it in an extra layer of defensive compounds, which means it acts almost like a biopesticide. And that's a really, really fascinating thing because it means your fertilizer is providing both nutrition and defense to the plant, which is a huge money saver. And that is because the earthworms uniquely have this biochemical pathway. And when you have a healthy population of earthworms, they're eating all the leaf litter from the plants around them, and they're cycling these defensive compounds, which gives the young plants, the seedlings that are born up around these earthworms, a head start. It gives them a better defensive system or a better defensive climate. And so as a consequence, those plants are more likely to grow up, they're more likely to produce more leaves and drop that down to feed the earthworm and its descendants. It's a big part of the symbiotic relationship, and it really hasn't been studied until recently. So we were really excited about this. We produced a whole bunch more of our liquid, and we decided to provide it to some more farmers. So this is an aquaponic spinach farm that was suffering from a mealybug infestation, and we thought it'd be a really good example because aquaponics, well, that means there's really no soil, so we can just spray with wild abandon and see if the actual chemical composition of the worm tea is making the difference. And we found that after 3 weeks, we really only sprayed these guys once with a backpack sprayer, that the mealybugs were completely gone and that the plants made a full recovery. And that was really, really encouraging. So myself and Gabe, we said, all right, we've got something really good here. Let's go into business with this. Let's turn this into a fertilizer company because, we've been doing the research for 3 years. Let's actually do something with it. That's a lot harder than research is, actually. We found that making a company is not something that chemistry majors and biochemistry majors are well suited to doing. So, for example, when you start a business, you don't get to use any of the lab equipment anymore from your university because you're a private business now. So we couldn't use our UV photospectrometers and our scanning electron microscopes anymore. We got to use a barrel, which was somewhat annoying. But we did get to learn a lot of valuable lessons about production and producing our own compound. And eventually we were able to make enough that we started providing this to a whole bunch of farmers and gardeners. There's only so many studies that you can do yourself as a college student. There's only so many plants you can try. So we decided to outsource it, just give away a bunch of bottles to neighbors and gardeners in a local area, do garden shows. And we got a huge amount of really positive feedback. And that positive feedback also led us to learning some more things. We learned that, for example, the polyphenol impact of pest dissuasion applies to more than just mealybugs and spider mites. It also applies to whiteflies and to thrip and to aphids to some degree and to even root gall forming nematodes. So it's a very wide-ranging kind of pest effect. We also found that the fertilizer impact has some really positive impacts on plants we didn't expect it to. For example, orchids. Orchids are not something you typically think benefit from most traditional fertilizers or from a worm tea, but in fact they do. We had an African violet grower who tried it, and they were getting blooms on their violets 3 times a year. They used WriggleBrew on it. They got blooms 8 times in that year, which was really, really cool. We also saw some really good results with recovering plants that were doing very poorly. And so with all these results, we said, okay, we've got some really good data. Let's talk to our university about getting some funding to turn this into a real business. So we reached out to the UCF and said, hey, could you fund us to start a business? And they said no, because the university doesn't typically fund students to start their own businesses. But they did invite us to participate in a competition called the Joust. And at our Joust competition, we had, well, for one thing, our university has 60,000 students. So there's lots of different teams. And we also had a team there that was backed by Google and a team that was backed by Microsoft. So we had a huge amount of techie competition, and we were the worm poop guys. So bit of a wild card contender. But I'm proud to say that we took the grand prize and got $15,000 of funding, which was really cool for us because it meant we could get some real lab equipment and get back to work on studying earthworms and their abilities. That also allowed us to get into some actual stores and get a website and stuff like that. And so as a consequence, we were able to get our product out there. We now have some farms that are actually using our stabilized shelf-stable worm tea for their crops, for growing things like soy and corn. We just shipped 5,000 gallons of it actually to a farm in Missouri, and they've been having some really amazing results with their soy. They've seen that, yes, there is better growth, but they've also seen better drought resistance. One of the wonderful things about worm teas is, as I mentioned, they're full of things like humic acid and indoleacetic acid, plant growth hormones, but they're also full of compounds that plants use to boost their immune system. So plenty of chelated micronutrients, but also things which plants rely on, like gibberellic acid, to signal the end of dormancy in seeds. So, for example, when we've used WriggleBrew on seeds, we found that, especially on corn seeds, the number that actually sprout is about 40 to 50% higher. And that's because gibberellic acid, a compound you find in worm castings, is the compound seeds use to come out of dormancy, to actually sprout. And that compound is one of the wonderful things about worm castings because it really demonstrates the relationship between worms and plants in a very direct way, because worm castings are particularly rich in gibberellic acid because worms are incentivized to signal to plants essentially that, hey, you're living in worm castings. This is a healthy soil. Please start growing so that you can eventually produce leaf litter for my offspring to eat. So they have this really interesting almost reflexive relationship in signaling and in their molecular biology. So it leads to a really positive feedback loop rather than the negative feedback loop that you see with things like nitrogen and phosphorus fertilizers. And that leads me to the last really interesting thing about earthworms and their abilities, and this will actually be a part of my next webinar. But that is that some worms have the ability not just to eat plant detritus and plant matter and turn those into nutrients, but they also have the ability to eat certain kinds of plastics as well. This is something that's very new. It was only first discovered in 2017, but many kinds of worms will also eat plastics. Plastics are a huge problem, as we're well aware. But these organisms, they've actually adapted means to eat it and digest it. So they're not just chewing on it like a toddler, but they're actually breaking it down chemically. And so that'll be a big part of my next webinar. But it goes to show that these organisms are just really exceptionally amazing at breaking complex things down into usable compounds. And that capacity is something we as a species, we humans, should really be taking more advantage of. We only really discovered earthworms were good for agriculture in the 1880s. And only about 40 years after that, we kind of forgot about it because we got obsessed with petrochemical fertilizers. Well, as always, we are now learning our lesson painfully. And this is the perfect time to reevaluate some of the relationships in the soil, both between the microbes and the mycelium and the things that are teeming in the soil, but also the larger guys, the worms themselves. And how we might be able to use them to fix soil as well. I think I'll open it to Q&A now. That's pretty much the majority of my webinar. But I really appreciate your time, and I hope you learned something about the power of earthworms today.
Thank you so much, Sam. I love this image here. And for those of you that aren't aware, Sam's coming back in 2 weeks to be on our webinar again and talk specifically about the earthworms and eating plastic and the work he's doing with that. So please join us for that, and we will share the information at the end and also in the follow-up email. So with that, if anyone has any questions and they'd like to unmute themselves and ask, feel free. And you're also welcome to put things in the chat. We'll read them out. We'll do this for about 10-ish minutes and then close up with our next events and end the event here.
I will add one more thing, since there's no outstanding questions. I didn't get to add this into my talk, but there has been a lot of research recently about earthworms sequestering heavy metals as well. That's something that's been really, really fascinating to me. It's been found that some earthworms are able to sequester things like cadmium and lead and arsenic. And it's a very interesting biological thing, because why would an earthworm want to absorb heavy metals selectively into its biomass? But the reason they do that is actually very sensible when you think about it from a evolutionary biology perspective, because if earthworms can absorb those heavy metals, they won't end up in the plants, which means their offspring will not be eating plant matter that is exposed to heavy metals, and or the plants will be healthier, which means more leaf detritus for them to eat. And so as long as the population of earthworms keeps going up, the average amount of heavy metals in any given earthworm will gradually go down across the population. So they have this kind of self-sacrificial biology that they've adapted that I think is just really fascinating. But yeah, if anyone has any questions. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, that's amazing, Sam. Thanks for sharing that.
It's cool. Yeah.
Jane would like to know what you feed the worms.
Oh, it's a very good question. So we want to feed them things that are rich in polyphenols, those defensive compounds. But we also want to make sure that they're just getting a balanced diet overall. So alfalfa is something that we love to feed to worms. They really do well with that. In general, they really like to have things that are a little green. They don't want like grass clippings because it's going to burn them out, but they like having a little bit of greenery. Spent brewery grains as well. That's something you can mix in a little bit. But what you really don't want to feed them is you don't want to feed them things like meat. You don't want to feed them acidic stuff. So obviously like onions and pineapples and things like that are kind of out. They're just a little too acidic. But also you can feed them different kinds of manures as well. So composted horse manure is something that we mix in with our spent grains and our alfalfa. And we found that works really well as well. Horses they're not very good at digesting things. So they leave a lot of nutrients left over in their manure.
Hey guys, this is Meredith. Hi Sam. I really am grateful for you to be here. Loved the presentation so much. I remember when you guys won your competition in college those years ago. We were just starting to form this company then, and so it's been it's just a joy to see it come to this point right now where we're working together like this. I can't wait till the next webinar. I want to say there's a lot of conversation out there in the industry right now in agriculture about clean compost products. You know, what is clean? There's all of these problems with the bio sludge, being applied to organic farms. Now they can't grow food, they can't sell their products because it's so tainted. So there's a real opportunity there for the kind of work that you guys have done to make a big dent in, in closing the waste loop cycle and providing a really clean fertility input for growers out there. So I'm really excited about the next webinar too. Just wanted to say that.
Thank you. Yeah. I mean, for example, in Brazil right now, they're using earthworms to clean sewage. It's very good at getting, like I said, heavy metals out of sewage, but it's also really good at just kind of converting it from kind of more noxious compounds into things that are a little more suitable for plants or for life in general. I saw there was a question from Meredith, the other Meredith, about whether you can add beneficial microbes to food stock. I'm not sure what you mean by food stock. Or do you mean like the food that is fed to earthworms? Yes. Yes, you can do that. And that is actually a really good tactic because it's something that worms are not really clean eaters. They have no etiquette. They're very messy eaters. So they're all picking up on each other's digestive microbes, which is gross to us, but to them, it's just part of the way they live. So by inoculating a worm bin or really even just your garden with positive microbes, those microbes, many of them will end up specifically the bacteria inside of the earthworms, which leads to better castings and to better composting in general. One of the easy ways to do this is to just aerate your worm bin or to get a higher oxygen content in there. Worms can put up with a low amount of oxygen, but the more oxygen, the more aerobic microbial activity you're going to have in general. Obviously, things like mycorrhiza and mycelia don't live inside of earthworms, but they will. The spores will end up inside of them, and they will deposit those spores as they move through the soil. They're wonderful little geoengineers. But that's a very good question. Cool. With that, I don't know if you want to take it away, Camille.
Yeah, well, I wanted to ask you one other question, Sam. When you were talking about the heavy metals, how does that work with the life cycle of a worm? So like if worms are taking up the heavy metals and they are sequestering inside of them, over the course of like the life cycle of the whole community, it's decreasing. But in terms of like the individual worms, does that get changed form into something else, or is it staying in those worms that are dying? What's sort of happening there?
So it stays in them. So it becomes part of their biomass. When the worm dies, obviously it returns to the soil. But if things are going well, the worm population is increasing, another worm will come along to absorb those same metals. So as long as there's a large population of worms, the heavy metals will not interact with anything really except the worms. And so this is actually kind of a bad thing in the US we're facing, because as we kill off more of our earthworms, we are essentially exposing ourselves to more and more heavy metals that we already polluted out there, but we're not feeling the effects of because we have a worm dividend. We have a worm cushion that is, and people don't realize how many earthworms there are. So in fact, there are several trillion of them. There are, I believe, several million, 7 to 8 million earthworms per person right now. And in a healthy field where you have crops or grass growing, there is an equivalent mass of worms below the soil as there is like living organisms above the soil, which means for every metric ton of cow you have on top of a field, you should have an equivalent metric ton of earthworm below that field, which means the farmer really has two different herds. He just doesn't realize it. He has a second herd down there that he should be caring for, but he can't see it. I mean, people are always talking about how cool bees are, but worms are just as important, if not more important in some ways.
Awesome. Thank you, Sam.
You're welcome.
All right, I'm going to share, if anyone else has other questions, feel free to jump in. But while we're doing that, I'm just going to share our final slide here. And I'm going to replace your styrofoam worm image, Sam, even though I love that. Okay, so we have two upcoming info sessions. Thursday, January 9th, which is in 2 days at 7 p.m. We'll do a half an hour info session in office hours. That's just going to be about in-soil algae and what the algae is doing, and some images and some data from our growers and research, et cetera. Lots of time for questions. We'll do the same thing on Wednesday, February 12th at 1 p.m. Eastern. Our next webinar with Sam for part 2, which we're calling From Plastic Waste to Healthy Soil, is going to be Tuesday, January 22nd at 7. All of these events you can register on our website at insoilalgae.com/events. Feel free to email us too. The links will be in the follow-up email to the webinar. And then we have some in-person upcoming events, the Southeast Fruit and Veggie Conference in Georgia later this week, and then No Till on the Plains in Kansas later this month. So come see us there. As always, feel free to reach out. We would love to chat with you. And for any of you all that are looking for CCA credits, make sure you have signed in using the QR code in your app. And if that is not accessible to you, just send me an email and I will make sure to get you signed in. So I will leave this up for a second. Anyone has any last minute questions for us, for Sam, please speak up. Otherwise, we hope you have a wonderful night, and thank you for joining us, and so much gratitude to you, Sam. Great presentation, and we can't wait to have you back on in a couple weeks.
Got a question.
Go ahead, Randy.
Hey, I just wonder, can you put too much of your WriggleBrew on or too often?
That is a very good question. And the answer, as far as we've been able to determine, is no, you cannot put too much of it on. So the nitrogen content is entirely baked into larger compounds like humic acid, which means they are not nearly as free radically and bioavailable as something like a urea or ammonia. So we have put 3, 5, 9, 10, 15 times as much as we have found is optimally useful, and found it has no negative impacts. It's just kind of a logarithmic curve in terms of growth for the plant. So these compounds and microbes sit around in the soil either until they're useful or until they just, sit there. But yeah, that's a very good question. And the answer is very fortunately, yeah, you really can't overuse it, which is, in my opinion, a big leg up over a lot of the nitrogen stuff, because it's very easy to overuse or underuse that stuff. Whereas this, well, once you reach the cap, it's, it's just benign.
With so much hormones and stuff in that, if it would cause any trouble, but doesn't sound like it. Good.
No, and actually, so this is where really the terminology doesn't help, but they call it a plant hormone, but it's actually not a hormone. It's actually just an organic acid. It's called a hormone because it behaves kind of like hormones do in our body, but it's more, it might be better described as a signaling molecule. So indole acetic acid being the big one you find in worm castings. When there's too much of that around, plants just don't use it. It basically just kind of sits there. So it's almost more like a vitamin than a hormone. But yeah, it's called a plant hormone in the literature. I don't really know why they chose that name.
Very much.
You're welcome. Thanks for the question. Cool.
Thanks, Randy. Thanks, Sam, and thanks everybody for being here. We will see you next time.